My name is Lacey Leone McLaughlin. This is Unfolding Leadership, and I'm honored to introduce Matt Littman. Matt has a wealth of experience in both government affairs and communication, quarterbacking public affair efforts for a wide range of clients, including Fortune 500 companies, Academy Award-winning actors, Super Bowl champions, NFL coaches, and members of Congress. He was Joe Biden's chief speechwriter during the Senate years and on his campaign for President of the United States. Matt also appears frequently on national television and provides expertise on political campaigns and the issues of the day. A real wizard of public affairs and current events. Please join me in welcoming Matt to the show.
Thank you, Lacey. Happy to be here.
Oh, it's our pleasure. I'm so excited to jump on in. To get us started, talk a little bit about who you are, how you spend your time, and what you're doing today.
So how I spend my time, I run my own public affairs firm. So I have about 4 clients that I can work on at a time. Beyond that, I can't do it. So I try to stick with the 4. And I work on mostly good causes and some causes that probably aren't as good, but are interesting and fascinating. And they're all interesting for much different reasons. Much of my work, Lacey, involves bringing people together around issues. And sometimes that could be something like a tax issue for a company, or it could be something like homelessness. But it all follows the same pattern, which is, how do I make a difference? How do I get this done?
How did you end up in the place that you're at today? So I was having a chance, I know a little bit about your work. I know I had a chance to look at your background and resume, and it seems like an interesting road that got you here. Talk a little bit about your journey, your story.
My journey is much different than anybody else's in my field. Because when I first started out, when I was probably 20, 21, working for a congressman who, of course, went to jail. And so then I had no idea what I was going to do. I was at a wedding in Washington. I met a film producer. She asked me to apprentice with her in a movie in LA. That sounded amazing, right? Yeah. So I came out to LA. I drive out in my grandfather's Maxima. And I come out, and within about a day, I'm fired from that job. They asked me to type a memo. I had no idea what that format looked like, and they literally fired me. So about a week later, this is a very LA story. The woman I was working for calls me up and says, "Where are you?" And I said, "I'm in my friend's apartment. You fired me last week." She's like, no, that's just temporary. Come back to work. So I did that. And then I became a writer's assistant, then a writer. And while I was a writer, somebody called me about writing a speech for an elected official, which I did not know was a paying job. And so I did that. And then they offered me a job. Shortly thereafter, started my own speechwriting business, which is how you mentioned Joe Biden in the introduction, how I met Joe Biden. While I was doing that, somebody else knew that I had contacts with a lot of elected officials. So they said, "We need help." It was actually the Spanos family that owned the Chargers football team.
Yeah.
We need help.
I'm a San Diego native.
Okay, so they basically own the town of Stockton, California.
Yeah.
They wanted the freeway expanded so more traffic can get to the port. So they needed help with Congress. So they hired me to do that. And then that began that stage of my career, which continues today.
Wow. It's so fascinating in terms of how you get from that kid being fired and being called back and writing, then to sort of this position of influence through speeches, and now all of the work that you're doing to help move issues forward.
I tell people honestly what I could do for them. Right. So I don't say to somebody, for example, let's say the company has an issue on taxes in Washington, D.C. I say to them, I'll get you heard, but I can't promise you a result. Right. And I think that's super important because people know that I'm an honest broker. I can promise people on any issue that they'll get heard where they want to be heard. But I can't promise you that, for example, a member of Congress will change their mind. Right. Yeah. I can promise you that they'll listen to you, but I can't promise a change. And it might be that happens, and that's great, and it's happened, but I don't promise it. So I'm very careful about what I tell people that I could do. Somebody asked me, Adam and Stacy Miller, these philanthropists here, they were concerned about the gun issue. How do we start? Is it worth starting a gun reform organization? Because there's so many out there. I don't know if your audience would realize this, but there are like 70 gun organizations that meet every month and talk about the gun issue in Washington, D.C. on a monthly basis. Right? Mm-hmm. But we haven't made enough progress. So they asked me, what's different? What could we do that's different? What I do, Lacey, is I go around and I meet with everybody on the gun issue and I find out what's working, what's not, what could we do that's different. right? Homelessness would be the same thing. What's working, what's not, what could we do that's different? When you pay somebody to do government affairs, it's not like you're paying them to make a widget. You don't really see the day-to-day return that you would if you're selling something. How do you oversee these people? And then sometimes companies, especially that are not like Washington, D.C. based, they get intimidated by their lobbyists because they think their lobbyists know more than they do. And they're sometimes afraid to tell them what to do. I'm not afraid. So that's why they bring me in to sometimes oversee that process. And that's something that I really have had great success with, really enjoy doing.
Yeah. So one of the things that you've just tapped on sort of tangentially is communication, or the lack of communication. One on the lobbyist side, one on all these organizations that are out trying to do the same work, but not connecting. How'd you learn this? I mean, is this something you knew right after you got fired from that first job when you were 23?
You learn, like I grew up in Long Island, you learn how to BS and how to get into clubs and things like that. And that's really, that becomes, you figure out how to turn that into work.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And it's really building positive relationships. I'm not the guy who's going out golfing with people. But what I will do, Lacey, is I'll do a dinner with members of Congress, speechwriters, lobbyists. It's perfectly above board. Everybody's paying for themselves, but we all get to meet and we get to chat.
Yeah.
And it costs nothing except the price of your dinner.
So finding your way in any industry is tough in general. So talk to me about what you would suggest for those people who don't have the connections, but know that trust and credibility and relationships are hugely important for their success and their future roles. Where do they start? What do they do?
Do a good job at whatever job you're doing. One of the things, Lacey, that I did was I was assigned to write speeches for NFL coaches, right? And so there's this coach, Sean Payton from New Orleans. And Sean Payton would talk about the importance of each lineman doing exactly their job and not worrying about what anybody else was doing, right? And so if everybody does their job, you win. That was his big message. And I've always taken that to heart, meaning the job you assign me to do, I'm going to do. So when you ask me to do something, I'm going to do my job, and that enhances my reputation. So when people know that I'm doing my job, then somebody else is going to ask me to do that same job, right? So you may not like the job you're doing, for example, but if you do well at your job and the people who are above you notice that you're doing it, that's it. That's the ball game. And it doesn't matter what you could be selling shoes in a shoe store. Just develop positive relationships, because you never know where people are going or what they might be doing.
Yeah. So first job or second job or third job, doing it, delivering, then what?
Well, so then the key is that the people that you work with are able to recommend you to other places and say that you've done a good job. So I was very lucky. When I started doing government affairs, I was working with Mark Fabiani and Chris Lehane. Fabiani was Bill Clinton's lawyer, if you remember. He has his own crisis communications firm. He's the lawyer for the Chargers. Lehane is now at Airbnb. New York Times Magazine wrote about him as the greatest political strategist in the country. They're brilliant guys. And they brought me in a couple of times to help them because it worked out a couple of times. So once people find out that you're doing that and it's working out, the idea is that more people will find out you're doing it and that it works out. Now, I can't, like I said before, promise success on every project. I just cannot. But I'll do the best I can. And if it doesn't work out, that's okay. It usually does work out 9 times out of 10. Having people recommend you and refer you is super important when you're in your own business.
So talk to me a little bit about the work that you are doing in entertainment and media. I'm sure our listeners would love to hear more about that.
In 2017, somebody came to me, knew I had friends in entertainment, and they represented the Democratic National Committee. And they said, could you put together a meeting of people in entertainment, not for fundraising purposes, but for messaging purposes? Okay. So I contacted like 20 people, and we started having these fantastic monthly meetings, and we bring in people to meet with us, and we do assignments for the DNC. They'd ask us to do things like get people to do a video or whatever it might be. We'd have members of Congress come in to read their speeches to see what we thought. I remember Michael Avenatti came in at that point. He was not in jail. And he did so well in that meeting that one woman in the meeting wanted to fix him up on a date, which thank God she did not. But it went really well. But then 2018 ends. Democrats, we were working for the Democrats, win. We end the project, right? Project ends. So now we're trying to figure out what to do next. And some of us are helping some organization in Wisconsin get people out to vote. But what ends up happening is Joe Biden wins the nomination. I contact somebody that I know at the DNC and I say, listen, we have all these contacts. What could we do to be helpful? So a person who's wonderful, her name is Adrienne Elrod. She, for example, ran the inauguration stuff that you saw on TV. I was nominated for an Emmy. She's wonderful.
Yeah, yeah.
And she calls me and she says, "Who do you know in entertainment?" So I send her a list. Like she's, kind of skeptically, I think she was saying this. I send her a list of people with their contact information. And she says to me, "Okay, stop. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to do a weekly meeting that you're going to put together between the entertainment industry and the campaign. You're doing it." So I said, "Great." So we started, Lacey, doing this meeting way before Election Day, several months before, on Mondays. And it was all these people in entertainment would get like the cast of The Boys and the writers from Veep. And, actors with big social media following, no social media follower, would get casting person, manager, all sorts of people to come on these Zooms. And we would get the Biden campaign. So we'd have, for example, the current Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, or Valerie Biden Owens, or John Kerry, or Mayor Pete, or the people who led in certain states. And the thing I would say to people is, on my side, which would be the entertainment side, and I'd moderate these conversations, is no complaining. If you're coming on these Zooms, the idea is to help the campaign, not to tell them what to do. Okay. And for the campaign would call me. This would happen all the time, Lacey. On a Saturday, the meeting would be Monday, and they'd say, "We got you, the 5th ranking person in Florida, to be on your Zoom." And I'd say, forget. For the entertainment people that we have on, they're not going to listen to the 5th ranking person in Florida who oversees the interns. They don't care. You have to have somebody who's on their level. Then the campaign would say to me, "Well, we're not doing the Zoom." And I would say, "Don't do it. I don't work for you. This is voluntary. You don't want to do it. I don't care. But if you want to do it, you got to get me the top person." And this would happen almost every weekend. And inevitably, they would then call me up and say, "All right, we got you Cory Booker on Monday." And so we'd have something like, so this is how it would go. The campaign would say, "We have a fundraiser in Michigan, but we don't have anybody to headline it." So there's an actor named Sam Richardson who's from Michigan. He'd say, "I'll do it." Right? Mm-hmm. The writers of Veep write a script for Julia Louis-Dreyfus to talk about voting. We came up with this thing called Celebrity Zoom Bombs. This was great, where we had the producer and editors from Parks and Rec and the director, Craig Zisk, do this thing where we would have, people in Pennsylvania would be on their Zoom talking about the campaign and what they're all doing. And suddenly Justin Timberlake would show up on their Zoom and they'd lose their minds. And so we would tape this and he would thank them for their work on the campaign. We did it with like Mark Hamill from Star Wars. Some guy had a Star Wars poster in his background. All of a sudden, Mark Hamill is on his Zoom, right?
Yeah.
So it was great. And the campaign actually put that on their own website. And we would do things like that, get out the vote stuff, Instagram live interviews where Helen Hunt would interview somebody from the campaign. So then that ends, Biden wins. Absolutely fantastic. Now what do you do, right? Mm-hmm. I can't leave where I live to go work for Biden in Washington, but I want to be helpful. People are kind of burnt out, Lacey, as you might imagine, from the campaign. So what we now do is we do a monthly meeting. We call it the news and what you could do about it. And we have on some incredible special guests ranging from political figures to Dr. Ashish Jha, the Dean of Public Health at Brown, who talks about COVID, to Michael Fanone, the police officer who was injured on January 6th. And we have on 30 to 45 people on the entertainment side. And we talk and we have conversations, and each guest is on for 15 minutes. And here's an example of what we're doing.
So that is amazing. We talk about leadership, and my reaction to everything that you've just heard is you are getting people to mobilize, spend their time, drive an impact around something that's important to them, which is time that they probably don't have, right, energy that they probably don't have, and for free. How the hell do you do that? How does that happen?
Question. Right. So the stuff we did during the campaign where people did for free, like this guy, Morgan Sackett, who produced Parks and Rec, who gave so much time to doing these Zoom bomb things. I was stunned at how much people were willing to do for free. I could not believe it. Yeah. And sometimes I'm disappointed that people aren't doing some things that I would expect them to do, but they don't do it. But people are willing to do things that are amazing. I'll send out this email, which you'll see, on the abortion issue, and people are going to do stuff. And it's more than they were doing before. And it's all voluntary, and it's not fundraising.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to push back on you a tad here, and I'm going to be a bit of a pain in the ass. So as an executive coach working with leaders, right, you're kind of saying it's just amazing. People will do this stuff. And I call a little bit of BS here. There is something that you're doing that is inspiring action. What is it?
I don't know. Lacey, I think what I'm doing is I'm just organizing everybody and they'll listen, right? So I guess I have some credibility with some people.
Okay. Okay.
And so they're willing to come on. And I think, it's very funny. There's a writer here named Billy Ray. I don't know if you know Billy Ray, but he's a prolific and wonderful screenwriter, very involved in Democratic Party politics. And he does his own interviews with people and all that. And he came on for a Zoom a few months ago and he was dumbfounded about how it worked. And the reason why it works is because we have people on for 15 minutes and then they're off, right? And that's it. So you're on a Zoom. You're sitting wherever, you could be in a cafe. We have one person Zoom in from a cubicle in a mall to be one of our guests. We have one guy who was on the ski slope, literally on the ski slope, as one of our guests, an actor, right? So anybody could do it. And the key part, Lacey, and this is very important, as you no doubt are aware, sometimes the things that celebrities are asked to do politically are incredibly stupid. They're just nonsense. They're not going to convince anybody to do anything. They're a terrible use of their time, somebody's money, and their credibility. It's a complete waste. The one thing that I would say is we are very careful not to waste anybody's time, not to ask anybody to make a stupid video that's not going to convince anybody. Celebrities do have power. The power is the people that follow them might not change their vote, but maybe they'll vote.
Yeah.
Maybe something like that, right? Maybe they hadn't thought about this cause. Maybe they'll think about it now. So again, in the area of credibility, I think people know that I'm not going to waste their time or their money or their image.
So hugely helpful. I hear the credibility. I hear the power of the ask, but there also has to be something around influence and inspiration. So what's your role in influence? How are you inspiring these people to take action? Because we know that's what gets people to do something differently, a change in behavior. What do you do to get that behavior? Influence, inspiration.
Yeah. Well, what I try to do is I bring people on who they might be inspired by very often, right? Once on these Zooms, I always try to bring somebody on who you're going to say, oh my, you may cry, right? So for example, in the next Zoom that I have, we'll have two secretaries of state, the secretaries of state of Maine and Michigan, to talk about how their jobs have changed since Trump, death threats and things like that. I suspect that that's going to be something that people are like, oh my God, I didn't even realize this was going on. This is terrible. How could I be helpful? And that's a big part of this, Lacey, is people don't know how to get in touch with each other. Like, how is the Secretary of State of Maine getting in touch with, Adam Scott, the actor, right? It's not happening. Mm-hmm. So the fact that we're able to bring these people together and there's no pressure, no money, no anything. You're just here to chat.
Yeah.
Is how we get it done. We say, we're going to bring on this congressman who you've never heard of before because they're not in your district, right? And they hear the person's story about how they grew up poor and depressed and they suffered from depression issues and dropped out of college. Well, who knew? There are 435 people in the House. Who knew about Richie Torres in New York, right?
Yeah.
And so, people get inspired. It's not me. It's the people who are telling their stories. And then you hear those stories. And now if you're on these, now you know that these Zooms are going to inspire you.
External perspective, you are a hell of a leader.
Well, it's very kind of you.
When you think about your role as a leader, how does that show up? None of this happens without that. So you can acknowledge it or not, but I promise you, none of this great work happens without your role as a leader. So what does that look like?
Well, I think when I think of, leadership or running a project, the one thing I would say is I work best with people who do what they say that they're going to do. If you don't do what you say you're going to do, that's bad news. So last year we formed a super PAC. And the super PAC, we were told, was going to raise a certain amount of money. And we found out very quickly that that wasn't nearly the case, right? And so it became a mess to have to end that because it turned out that, and the people who made the commitment to what they were doing did not understand why everybody else was so upset with them. Well, if you make a promise that you're going to do this thing, and then you don't even do it at all, not even close, that doesn't work. So I will say, in the way that I work, everybody needs to do what they say they're doing.
Yeah.
Right. And if you do what you say, don't overpromise. But if you do your job, like Sean Payton said, everybody else is going to be able to do their jobs and we'll win.
So in those situations, how do you as the driving force behind some of these things, hold people accountable?
So, a couple of times, in that case, I will say I didn't handle it well. I was stunned by what was happening. I've never seen anything like it, but I do. What I do is, if I have any skills, I have very few skills. Let's see. One is typing fast, which doesn't help me at all. And two is, when I talk to people on Zooms, in our meetings, every client, you have a conference call every week or every other week, is going around and making sure people say what they're doing and then tell us what they need to do a good job, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's organizing. Let's say it's Boeing as a client, there are 25 people on that Zoom, but you go to each person. What are you doing? So everybody knows what that person is doing. What's going to happen in the next couple of weeks? What do you need from the rest of the team?
What can I do to support you in your job? Or how am I blocking and tackling so you can go do your job? And that just sounds like it's happening really naturally for you, just sort of integrates in.
I'm afraid of how many people I see try to get in the way of what somebody's doing. I mean, it really is disturbing to me in a lot of different companies that I've seen where, the safest thing to do is say no, right? Whenever somebody wants to do something or they need help. It's like, I would compare it, Lacey, to the movie business. The easiest thing to do is to say yes to the new Spider-Man movie. The hardest thing to do is when somebody comes up with an original romantic comedy to be the person on the hook and say yes, right? The same thing is true in corporate America. If you stick your head up, you're responsible. And if it doesn't go perfectly, you might get fired, right? And so the easiest thing to do whenever somebody wants to do something, no. And it's a joke, but that's the way it goes in a lot of these big corporations. Yeah. So the key part is if somebody says, you have to be willing to be on the hook. And if somebody says, I need X, Y, and Z support, and then I think I could do this, you've got to take responsibility and say, we'll help you do this. We'll get to that point. And it bothers me when I see, if you wonder why some companies can't do the things they need to do, sometimes make the changes they need to make, because it's a responsibility. And I'll give you, if you don't mind, an example in the political world.
Yeah.
If the person in charge does not want the truth, then the people below them aren't going to give it to them. And very often, especially in politics, if you see things in politics where you say to yourself, well, that person has to realize that this isn't working, it doesn't work like that. Because the person who says this isn't working, this is what we should do, is very often removed from the equation by all the other head nodders.
Yeah. And that's already challenging enough because we know there's so much research out there that says the higher you go within a role, within an organization, the less inclined people are to be honest because they're afraid of
right? Is there research that says that?
There is. There's a lot. So higher you go, less truth, more high risk decisions, right?
Right.
So yeah, you think about that. And that is, so if you think about that anyway, we're inclined to hold back. And then you're a leader that doesn't want to hear. I can imagine 5%, 2% of what you're getting is actual reality.
Absolutely. Because, the person they'll fire you. And it's really a question of willpower. Does the person really want to do this? Do they want to have to say to their relative, you can't work on this, right? You can't be the closest person to me in this issue. No, they don't. Right? Some people don't like confrontation. Some people don't want to make those difficult decisions.
So it is so clear to me that you're leading on so many fronts, from a company perspective, from an organizational perspective, from an impact and influence perspective. And the fascinating thing for me is all this leadership stuff just comes out in your stories without even appearing like or try or are intentional about it, but it's all there. Credibility, trust, creating teams, blocking and tackling for your people, influencing, inspiring. It's all there. And what's so amazing is you're doing it. It's working well. And I don't even know if you know how much of that stuff is showing up. It's awesome.
Lacey, I really don't think about it the way you think about it, but I appreciate it because my job is to do my job, like Sean Payton says, right? To do my job. So, one thing, right, exactly, right.
You have left our listeners with so much today. Any final thoughts before I close this out?
Just be a person of your word, Lacey, is my biggest thought. Do what you say you're going to do, and then you'll win.
That's awesome. I have enjoyed this conversation so very, very much. And I know the people listening are going to learn a lot about the intentionality of leadership and the stuff that just happens if you're the lineman doing your job and delivering. Thank you so much for your time.
Great to talk to you.
What I'm left with is the question that leaders should ask. Do you want to know the truth? Are you listening to your team, to your employees? Like Matt, sometimes we all lead without knowing it. Sometimes we lead and it's unintentional. Think about those moments. Think about what or if you would do something differently if you were truly hearing what your team had to say. This is episode 5 of Unfolding Leadership. Thanks for listening.